something in me knew that that would be the right call and that would be the right framing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to step like 6 years back and, try and like,
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty unique choice to make. So it's a unique thought. I mean, why aren't you trying to frame yourself as a designer or, somebody with really good visual aesthetic or,
yeah.
why are you framing yourself thinker? What did that get you?
So I think to me, I've always tried to do things a bit differently. Not necessarily because like I'm different, but because when you stand out, you increase your odds of success. If you're like in a stack of 100 people and you have a thing that looks different, it doesn't always even matter what that thing is. You're going to get more attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like with the Accept Joel site, I knew no one is like creating a website that says accept this person, and I framed it as like a set of instructions, like 5 steps on how to accept me to your school. And like that's really fucking snarky and
Mm-hmm.
presumptuous, and it worked.
So, okay, let's talk about the problem, like full stack anxiety. Is this still something that you think exists? Let's define that first.
Sure. So this came out of a tweet, basically.
I saw that. Yeah, it was like 2015.
Something like that, where just like, yeah, full stack anxiety is just like dealing with I don't even remember what I wrote, but like dealing with the crazy pace of the industry and not really knowing, oh, you know what it was? It was being like a designer who codes. It's like, I don't know if I need to focus on design or if I need to focus on code, if I need to focus on, research or all these things that are all part of my job. All of them have these, methodologies associated with them, tooling associated with them. And it just gets to be a lot when you have like a pool of like, oh, there's, 50 things I could learn right now. And it's hard for me to tell what's going to be the most impactful for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to tell, what each of these things really means for my career and where I'm going. So that's where it started. And yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's still an issue. If anything, more than ever. I mean, it's just becoming more and more of a thing as the industry moves forward. There's just like now, when I did that talk, it was kind of clear. So I mean, I did a talk.
Yeah.
So after that tweet, I mentioned it on like another podcast, and there was a lot of resonance for that. And I heard from a lot of people that, I put I put a term to a thing that they were all feeling. And I figured it was something that maybe, could use more thought and could be dived into a bit deeper. And so I started speaking in a bunch of conferences and doing this talk called Full Stack Anxiety. And when I started doing it, like in terms of design, right? Everyone was transitioning from Photoshop at that point to Sketch.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like the tail end of that transition. Most people had already been moving to Sketch, but like there was one tool that I think most of the industry kind of aligned around being like, oh, the right tool for the job. And now in terms of design, you have like Sketch, you have Figma, you have Framer, you have Adobe XD when they came back around with modern tooling. Sure, I'm forgetting like 5 or 6 more. But that's just one example, and you see this everywhere. Like as it becomes, both easier and more lucrative to invest in developer tooling or design tooling, you get this fragmentation of an industry that's just like, oh, I have like, I can use NPM or I can use Yarn or I can use all these different things. You just like figuring out what to put your energy into is I think only going to get harder.
Yeah, it's the exact same problem on the front end as from a developer perspective. I'm like more pure developer. Actually, like right around that time when you were doing this, I wrote a book called Sketching with CSS, which was for designers, and the notion was, rather than trying to do all of your comps in, well, at least at the time, there was this movement called designing in the browser. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
And so a lot of designers were feeling pretty overwhelmed by that particular idea. And so the book was essentially, here's front-end development, like core set of tools that you can use to do that. And yeah, I feel like that even it's just kind of shocking how fast we moved past that too. We're not really, as an industry, we don't ever settle for very long on anything, and it does feel like it's getting worse. It's the same. You mentioned all this tooling that you guys have to pick as designers now. Like the question that all of us have all the time is like, what do I learn? What should I learn? What should I spend my time on?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same thing when like we all aligned around object-oriented CSS or like BEM, and then 2 years later, it's like the most modern thing. It's like everyone thinks it's great, and 2 years later, it's like no, BEM sucks. It's functional CSS now, or CSS and JS, and like it's like as just a person in the industry, you're like, I don't know, I don't know how to keep up with this. Like I thought I was cutting edge for a second there.
And I feel like the one problem that this causes is, so like at your job probably doesn't matter because you're just going to do whatever you're supposed to be doing there and whatever makes sense there. But we don't really stay at our jobs for very long. And part of the problem is we can't, because if you're just doing whatever they have you doing at that job, then say something happens and you need to or you just want to move along in your career, you've now sort of put yourself in a corner in terms of the skill set that you have and the tools that you're using. It's either that, or then you end up trying to force the people at your work to do something, the new thing, even though maybe they don't need it. Do you ever feel that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with design, I think it's a bit less so because it's kind of agnostic from the implementation in a lot of ways. So it doesn't necessarily matter if I design something in Sketch or if I design it in Figma or if I just spec it out and tell my developers hey, here's what I'm thinking, and talk with them about it and figure it out and then just make it with the design system. I think inherently design is a bit more flexible in that sense because I don't need to tap into the framework we're using. On the other hand, design tooling is getting a bit more, complex and powerful. And so now if I don't use Figma, I don't have access to the components that our design systems team has built, which make it easier for me to put together mocks and spec things out. And so there is kind of a push to learn things that your team is using for sure.
Makes sense. So I remember part of the talk was you sort of outlined some ideas for how you might solve this as a person in the industry trying to navigate the craziness. What were some of your ideas? And I'm curious if you think they're still relevant. I mean, it's been a few years. It's been infinity as far as web development goes, almost 4 years.
Yeah. It's been a lifetime. I think 'cause the stuff I put forward was a pretty generic framework. It was just be thoughtful about these decisions instead of just falling into something. Yeah, I don't think I think technology. I think it's going to be as relevant in 100 years, unless you can just download something to your brain chip or whatever. But the premise is okay. I also the talk was directed mostly at people just entering a new industry or switching careers. And so I think a lot of that is going to have to shift for someone who's I'm in the industry. I just need to figure out where to grow.
Let's talk about that, because I think that's primarily the listeners are more, mid-level experienced people in the industry, not just beginning. Because I do think it's totally different problems. When you're just starting out, that's an insanely overwhelming problem right away, where you're like, okay, well, how do I even enter into this? What's the first thing that I should do?
Yeah.
But now you're there, and now you need to sort of continuously navigate this problem. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about that from a more experienced perspective?
So I think having context is half the battle. When you're starting out, the biggest issue is I don't even know what these things are. I don't know what people want. I don't know why. So even just understanding that will take you a long way. I think when you're kind of mid-level, you're already in this industry, you already have your stack. It's less about what are people looking for now. So one of the things I suggested to people was hey, look through job descriptions out there and pinpoint the different skills that you're interested in, or that seem not you're interested in, but seem like they come up frequently. And then you can start building an idea of what the industry values, and you can start designing your own skill set around that. So for instance, if you start seeing, hey, people are looking less for PHP and now they're looking for Rails, or people are looking less for Rails and now they're looking for React, then you can be okay, I want to pour my energy into React right now. But there's also, there's a lot of fads, right? In like, especially in engineering, where like everyone can build their own framework, and it's hard to know what's really going to stick around and what is going to have longevity. I think like I don't know, I don't really have the ability to tell you, okay, what are things going to look like 2 years from now? Like, is it going to be React or Vue or something else? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows really. Like, there's indicators, right, based on like the size of an ecosystem or how like the the health of a community or whatever. But very easily a year from now, someone could come up with something that turns the entire industry on its head, and they're just like, "This is the new paradigm," and everything is obsolete now. So I think a lot of it is just being responsive to what's happening around you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also just like knowing, like when it comes to like the panic and the anxiety of it, like knowing you can fill in those gaps. So it doesn't have to be, synchronous. You don't have to like, oh, there's a new thing. I immediately need to know this new thing.
Yeah, you have a little wiggle room.
Totally. Like, okay, for instance, like for me, probably kind of ironically, like it's been maybe 3 to 4 years since I've really developed any new hard skills. So after that talk, or like during that talk, I transitioned to management. There's a lot of softer skills associated with management, or there's a lot of hard skills that you don't necessarily create anything with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm better at creating process, I'm better at creating hiring plans and conducting one-on-ones and like dealing with issues and working on spreadsheets or whatever. But during that time, I wasn't learning like the cool new tool. I wasn't learning, how to design for AR or whatever. And so in a lot of ways, technically I should be behind the curve. But also the direction that my career has gone, that stuff has been inherently less valuable to me than it would be for maybe someone else in a different company or a different position. Like, I joined GitHub, I moved back from management into an IC role.
I see individual contributor.
Individual contributor, yeah. And so at GitHub, I'm the designer for pull requests and code review. And with that, knowing Figma isn't really as important as kind of a high level thinking and understanding of systems and figuring out how systems connect, and then knowing how to do research, all this stuff. And research is kind of a hard skill too, which I have improved at. But what I'm saying is, like, your career can take you so many different ways and in so many different directions. And the things that we consider like, CV skills, like the stuff that you put down of like, I'm 5 stars at whatever, those have become like less important. And in general, as you become more senior, I don't know exactly. I'm assuming that in engineering it's similar. Like, when you build experience, you're learning about like patterns and architecture, and it's less important that you know all the ins and outs of Go or whatever.
Sure. So I want to dig into that a little bit from the hiring perspective, because
Sure.
this is definitely a theme that comes up over and over again in the conversations I've been having for the podcast. And the theme is that at some point, the sort of the ideal, well, one way to deal with this as you become more experienced is to sort of decouple your value as an employee from the skill sets that you have, and be from that's not quite the right way to put it, but from like the hard skills that you have versus the soft skills that you have. So the more experience you get, then ideally you shape your career such that prospective employers care more about the fact that you have these core fundamental design, like if there's a designer, like design level thinking and experience, which could translate easily to whatever system we're doing. So that they're going to bring that to the table. So yeah, it's tough to get there. Like, one of the problems with that is if you go through the normal hiring process, the filter there up front is just your skill set, right? So there's like an automatic wall between you and a job, even if you're very experienced. Say you don't have quite as many years of React experience as they want, but you've been doing JavaScript development for 12 years, right? Which is kind of similar. I kind of ended up in that situation. It was sort of, you have to figure out how to route around that problem and to get to talking to the right people. But yeah, so I'm really curious, like on your team, when you were hiring, let's say somebody didn't know Figma, but they were a very experienced designer that you learned from, on the internet or knew of and wanted to work with, would that be a deal breaker? They don't know Figma?
Not at all. I mean, for me, when I was hiring, I was tool agnostic. I was even like coding agnostic, and this is me hiring for a designer for DigitalOcean, like a very, very technical company. What I was looking for were, the kind of transferable skills, more of like the makeup of the person, of like, can they think in systems? Can they work with people? Can they like lead to good outcomes? I think, ideally everyone should think that way because that's how you hire good people. That's how you end up with like a productive and effective team. Someone being like really good at Figma isn't necessarily the thing that's going to shift things. But I do think like, so I have another talk that I did, I think about a year ago, called what is it? Designing appropriate teams, something like that.
Hmm.
And there I kind of go into more of like the hiring perspective of this, of how I think you should build your team. And that's more like figuring out the gaps within your team. And that gap might be, we want to, align around Figma, and we need someone who's really good at Figma who can, push the entire team up. That might be the case in some instances. It's never been for me, but it might be.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe in that case, you're more likely to hire a trainer or something like that temporarily.
Yeah. But like, oh, we need someone on the team who's really good at research. We needed someone at the team who has like a lot of experience with mobile, all this stuff. Right. So that's more contextual, I think. A lot of companies I see just end up putting like a bucket list of all the things that their team already does.
Hmm.
And they're just like, you need to know all of these things. You need to know, experience with mobile, experience with Figma, experience with, design systems, experience with, et cetera.
Yeah, that sounds like, I mean, it's the same problem with developers, same exact problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the problem there is just like a lack of time and a lack of discipline and a lot of hiring managers to really think about what they need versus just, oh, we have our hands full with 10 projects and we
Hmm.
just need more headcount, and let me just take this cookie cutter job description and put it up on the site. And a lot of like, hiring sucks across the industry. So like a lot of people suffer from this. And I think teams and managers suffer from it as well.
Hmm. Yeah, hiring is truly one of the most awful things about our industry right now. I mean, there are many awful things, but trying to get a new job is just a miserable experience. I don't know if designers have the equivalent of like code interviews where you have to like code in front of people or like pop quizzes on random technical information. I don't know if that's a problem there too.
Yeah, for us, it's like we have. So it's less that it's not like figure out an algorithm on a whiteboard, but it is like. So I think in general, design hiring is a bit better if done well, because a lot of people are just like, hey, here's a take home exercise, design an entire app, and we're not paying you. Like a lot of people do that.
Do you do that for your hiring process? Do you do a take home thing? I mean, that's really common for developer jobs. Super, super common.
Yeah, we are doing one now, but we're doing it in a way where it's just like we want maybe, spend an hour on this. And if you don't design anything and you just write your thoughts, that's fine. And the thing that that's trying to filter out is similar to a lot of our whiteboard exercises that people do in product design, are like less about what does this person know and more about how does this person think. And so sometimes a whiteboard exercise is like, how would you redesign like a radio? And it has nothing necessarily to do with the job, but it tells you a bit about, how a person can scope a decision in like a project, how creative a person can be about possibilities, how everything interacts, how that person is thinking about constraints and the end users. And so I think in a sense that stuff is better, but it's also like, you're taking like potentially, a person who's super nervous, just went through a loop of like 5 interviews, and now you put them in front of a whiteboard and there's like a ton of pressure to, succeed there. And so you're not necessarily getting the best of that person.
No, I'd say it's low odds that you're getting the best from somebody in that situation. And plus, like, I don't know. Do you do that? Do you do whiteboarding like that when you were hiring?
We started doing a bit of it at the end. It's a process. I don't think there's any like industry standard for what's going to work well.
Mm.
At the end of the day, like this is a huge problem from both sides, right? It's a problem for the candidate because they're just trying to get a job and they have to deal with all of these like different processes and like put a lot of investment in every job opportunity.
Hmm.
And when you have 5 of those, you're like, okay, each one of these is going to take me, whatever, 12 hours. And if I have my job right now, how am I going to balance that? It's really tough. But on the hiring side, on the team side as well, people are just clueless about what makes a good teammate, about which hire is going to really, mesh well with the team, do really good work, make everyone better, like be a culture ad. It's hard to figure that out. It's hard to get at whether someone is a genuinely good designer or engineer, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think we have a lot to figure out in that sense.
Well, so you said it's hard to figure out if they're going to be a good culture ad. So one thing that I always get a little squinty-eyed about is when people talk about culture fit. I've definitely seen that applied in really, really bad ways. But then you immediately follow that by saying, are they talking about their design skills? So for you, culture ad isn't necessarily like a certain type of person in terms of their personality, but more about how they approach their job as a designer. Am I getting that right?
No, actually, no. When I think about culture ad, I mean about someone who has a different perspective from the team.
Mm-hmm.
Someone, of course, who can fit into the team's culture in some way, but not to the sense, not like a let's grab a beer and that's great. But yeah, when I say culture ad, I mean someone who can really make the team better by providing a new perspective.
Okay, so you're saying culture ad, not culture fit.
No, I also don't like the term culture fit. It leads to teams that are super homogenous, and it's hard to add people to those teams. They get kind of toxic potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've seen culture fit be an excuse for almost outright racism, actually, in one case. I mean, it's not I feel like it's that's the worst case scenario, but that's definitely a problem.
Yeah, I mean, across the industry, it's racism, sexism, and any kind of ism. It's just oh, you don't fit the mesh of a 25-year-old white dude, then sorry. And that's never oh, you're not a 25-year-old white dude, but it's you don't really like grabbing beers after work, or you don't play, Overwatch or whatever. Yeah.
So I have kids, so I don't do that. Yeah, I mean, ageism, it's definitely a huge part of it. So part of this is to figure out how do we kind of, we can only do what we can do. We can only control what we can control. And you have an awesome hiring process that thinks deeply about this, but not every company does. So it's sort of, so how do you route around that? So my question for you is, you've had an awesome career, very successful person, and you're welcome. I think that it would be really interesting to hear just how you sort of worked your way through each of these jobs that you've done. I mean, I noticed you started off as a consultant, freelancer, doing that, and then went on to full-time employment. So when you did make that move, were you just throwing out resumes, or how did you make that move?
Yeah. So I've never just thrown out resumes. I think my career...
I'm sorry, this is a super common theme. Every time I talk to somebody that's good, that has a successful career, they never do that. That seems to be the worst way to get a job.
It's a combination of a lot of luck and some savvy.
Mm-hmm.
The luck is when I was, I don't know, 11, 12, I started learning HTML and PHP and Photoshop, and just kept doing that. And so by the time that I'm ready to, start a job, I have a lot of skills that people who just came out of school don't necessarily have. I was awful at it for most of my life, just to be clear. So that's one thing. Getting freelance customers was just trial and error. And honestly, I wasn't really focused on it. It was here and there when someone would approach me. And then so I can just do my exact career story and see if anyone gets something from that.
Please.
But I had just been doing HTML with BG color and tables and whatever, and I'd been putting off learning CSS, similar to a lot of folks today with all these new things, right? But CSS had become more popular, and I'm oh, I can apply a style to a thing. How novel, right? And I'm just I don't want to do that. I know how to do my thing. I know how to create bordered rounded edges with a table and 9 images. I know how to hot switch a thing with JavaScript to create a hover thing. I'm just I don't need to know anything. I know how to make the internet. And when I was I was in the army and from Israel, And so at a certain point there, I was just like, okay, I have some free time on my hands. I was like in the middle of the desert with nothing to do, and they'd let me like bring an old chunky laptop. I was just like, okay, let me try the CSS thing, and I like bought a book. I don't remember, like I think Dan Setterholm or something, and I started going through that and I started learning. And then sometimes you have these periods where you're just like, oh, I'm really enjoying learning right now. So I just, I did bulletproof HTML, I think it was called, bulletproof CSS, something like that, and just kept going. And, had like a period of like, oh, I'm cutting edge now at this point. And that led to like better gigs and like more interesting sites. And finally, like after the army, I was like, I worked tech support. And then I was like, I know I don't want to do this. I thought the money was like absolutely wild. At that point, I was like, oh my God, I'm making whatever, 40 shekels an hour or whatever. It's not much. And I just like, I didn't give, I was just like, I've been doing this my entire life and I know what I want to do. And I think even that's an immense privilege. Like lucking into like a career that's just a hobby that turns into like a lucrative thing is amazing. Like I could have just as well been into like, I don't know, pogs or whatever.
Sure.
Like, just it happened to coincide with the tech industry becoming this big thing and design gaining a lot of respect. And so like after the army, I got a gig at I like designed a new portfolio. I put it out there. I got a gig at an agency who had just seen this portfolio, and I think the reason I got that was it was called acceptjoel.com. It was a portfolio I made because I was like, I need to actually learn this stuff because I don't know color theory, I don't know typography, I don't know any of the things that really make a good designer. And I made that. Speaking of like not just throwing a CV around, I made that for Parsons, for like the design school in New York, which is how I ended up in New York. And I only applied to Parsons. And that's a really dumb thing to do in hindsight. But like I designed this entire website around just that one school of like, it was called acceptjoel.com.
Mm-hmm.
And it went like semi-viral because the type of, was like this old side-scrolling website with like full of like all these graphics. I don't think it works anymore really. But they had seen that because it went semi-viral. And they were like, oh, this person's in Israel and they have like this interesting outlook on web design. Let's get them in here. And so that's mostly luck, I think, like that person happening to see the thing. But it's also just because I took this portfolio project and I poured my heart and soul into it, right? It was the best thing that it could have been because I put just that much effort in. And I didn't plan on getting a job with that. It's just like when I poured it into that ended up becoming like leading to all these different opportunities. And I think that's happened time and time again in my life. That's like when you put something out into the world. Of course, like that's, there's layers of privilege and, I have an American accent, so I can do things that other Israelis don't necessarily aren't necessarily able to do. I present as a white person. I'm a guy. It's like I come from a family that like wasn't needing for money. So like a lot of that, of course, is the foundation of a lot of these things because I had time to work on that portfolio. So I understand it's like trickier for other people.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's assume like that it's a given that it's not a given that people have those advantages, obviously, but that when we're talking about when you're telling your story about how you are successful, that it's a given that there are plenty of people that are like you that did not do what you did. And
totally,
we're talking to those people. It's more useful to that, to that crowd. And then I think it's useful to everyone in general, but there's other people have even more things that they have to deal with on top of that.
Yeah.
So what's different is like you actually made a thing.
Yeah, I made a thing. Really, that's how it started. I made a thing. I just the whole privilege thing. I tend to mention it now because I want it to be clear that
Yes,
exactly what you said is like people who have the exact same makeup maybe and people who put the exact same effort in. I don't want this to be taken as like, hey, I'm guaranteeing the same thing will happen.
yes,
no. And it sucks that it doesn't.
No, there's so many, like what we talked about, culture fit. And, the example that I saw of a person of color who was not hired because it wasn't, they seemed rough around the edges. Seriously, I saw that happen and it was just unbelievable. It's a perfect example. There's loads of that. Yeah, it's definitely a huge problem in our industry. It's good to point that out.
Yeah. So I would say I benefited from like luck, savvy, and people always giving me the benefit of the doubt and kind of inherently trusting me, which I've benefited immensely from and is also extremely fucked up.
So luck. Let's talk about how you built more opportunities for luck.
Yeah. So I mean that opportunity was already a thing because like, oh, I have like an actual, like, I'm not just freelancing. I'm working at this big agency, which is now like the biggest agency in Israel. We were like 30 people back then. So that gives you clout, right? And then you put that aside, and I started, I got into Parsons. I came to New York. I think that's one of the probably the absolute biggest thing that happened to my career is like moving out of Israel and gaining access to opportunities for international companies. So I was in New York. I happened to be reading like Hacker News for like a while. I don't even know how I ended up reading it. But at some point they had like a YC conference in New York, and I went to that, and I was like the only designer there. They had like different colored badges, and everyone else was an engineer. And I was like, oh, that's weird that the only designer here. And so I got a lot of attention. And like I mean, it also sucked. At one point, I was like, was in a circle with like Paul Graham. He's like, "What hex code is this?" And I'm like, "You're an asshole."
What hex code is
not
this?
what I do. Yeah.
What?
But yeah, that aside,
how weird.
I met a lot of people. Like I hung out with like the Codecademy people when they were just two people. I met like a lot of different companies who all kind of wanted to start working with me only because I was just the designer at that conference. Like I don't think any of them really knew if I was good or not. And then through a random friend, I met Seth Bannon, who was the CEO of Amicus, which was my first startup that I worked at here in New York. And again, that was the thing. They were just like, also just happened to be coincidentally going to YC like right after that. But I met him through this person that I met through another friend because I was like new to New York, and it just happened, right? It's a really small world, and I think every job I've gotten has been through some kind of serendipity. And that one was easy. That one was just coming in and being like, here's my portfolio. Like, I'm dope. You should give me this job. And that ended up being like a 2-year thing until like the company went through startup stuff, and everyone had to find new jobs. And at that point, it's kind of like these ebbs and flows of the industry. Like my portfolio was extremely outdated.
Yes. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it didn't look like the aesthetic of, what people expected at the time. It didn't include the newer projects that I was more proud of. And at that point, there was some Amicus stuff. Like I designed some important flows there, but most of it was schoolwork. Like that's what I'd been doing for the last 4 years is, making all these different creative projects. Some of them were kind of apps, not great ones, but most of it was like print stuff and these different things. And so like I had to find a way to frame all of that stuff in a way that was convincing to hiring managers in tech, because I realized that's what I wanted to do. And also, by the way, throughout these couple of years, from like when I was at the agency, I was a web designer. I was like mostly doing visual design. And in school, I like realized, hey, visual design isn't that interesting to me anymore. And really what I want to do is more of like the user experience design or product design or whatever. And so I don't know, we can talk about that later, but I think as you progress, you also become interested in different things, and that has different implications for what you need to learn. Sidebar. Anyway.
Good side.
So I'm kind of figuring out how to frame all this work, and I decide to basically make everything a case study. So like my portfolio was like a small book essentially. It had like 70,000 words or something. Each project, there were 9 projects, and each one of them I dived into decision making and like why I did the things I did. Because I was like, if I show someone this like, this booklet that I designed, that's not going to be impressive. That's just going to be they'll look at it and they'll breeze forward. And really the thing that I'm trying to sell is me as a thinker. And so that's where like I think a bit of savvy comes in, of just like trying to understand and this is a lot of design too, and like a lot of marketing is like.
Can I ask you a question? Why did you want to position yourself or sell yourself as you the thinker?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think when I say savvy, I think I mean like an inherent understanding of your surroundings. Something in me knew that would be the right call and that would be the right framing. And it's hard for me to like, step like 6 years back and, try and like.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty unique choice to make. So it's a unique thought. I mean, why aren't you trying to frame yourself as a designer or, somebody with really good visual aesthetic, or, why are you framing yourself thinker? What did that get you?
So I think To me, I've always tried to do things a bit differently. Not necessarily because like I'm different, but because when you stand out, you increase your odds of success. If you're like in a stack of 100 people and you have a thing that looks different, it doesn't always even matter what that thing is. You're going to get more attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like with the Accept Joel site, I knew no one is like creating a website that says accept this person, and I framed it as like a set of instructions, like 5 steps on how to accept me to your school. And like that's really fucking snarky and
Mm-hmm.
presumptuous, and it worked because it was different. Because even though it was different, it was obvious that I'd done it with like respect and effort, and I wasn't just trying to breeze through. And that's the same thing I did with the next portfolio, which was just like all of these paragraphs and paragraphs of like the earliest designs, sketches, like how I was thinking, documents, messages between me and different people that showed the process of the creation. And I figured, okay, these people are going to be working with me. They want to know that I can think the right way. They want to know how I interact with other people. And so I just put all of that in there. And I was like, no one's doing this. Like case study portfolios weren't a thing that existed back then. They are now. A lot of designers have them now, and I think they're better. Like as a hiring manager, it's way easier to tell if someone's going to be a good fit if I can like look through and see like what do they care about and gain something instead of just like, oh, here's a mock. It's nice. So I did that, and it also went viral. And again, this is like, it's lucky. Like this thing resonating is not up to me. Like I can try and be different. I can have an opinion about what the right thing is to put out there, but whether that thing lands or not, like, go figure. But it happened to. And so DigitalOcean was a result of 3 things. One thing was the founder of my company reaching out to IA Ventures, which was one of our VCs, and they're also one of DigitalOcean VCs.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the message, sent it down to the founder. We're like, hey, this designer is looking. Is it interesting? That's one thing. The other thing is the portfolio went viral, and the hiring manager had seen it before seeing me. And then the third thing was I had been organizing hackathons.
Mm-hmm.
And DigitalOcean is like a big sponsor in hackathons, and I'd become like interested in them. And so I also applied directly with like a specific cover letter. And so this person was getting me from 3 different directions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of that played to my advantage. And then, of course, they gave me like homework, and I did all that homework.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it in a way I was just like, okay, the portfolio obviously resonated with this hiring manager. Let me do this homework as the same type of case study that like I put in every project in my portfolio. And I mean, that worked out.
So say you're on the other side of the table and you're hiring somebody and all of these things happened. Well, I mean, how much more likely would you be to hire that person versus somebody who's kind of just normally going through the process?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever had to really deal with that, just coincidentally.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would take a lot of discipline to like not let any of that get to you.
Okay, that's an interesting way of putting that. You feel like that's, as a hiring manager, that you would be introducing some bias if you were getting, acceptjoel.com or the portfolio or all this extracurricular stuff that would be bias that you don't want?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so yes, I think ideally you don't want any of that bias because you're not trying to see if someone's like putting a lot of effort into the interview process. Because again, that speaks to like potentially just privilege. Like they have a lot of time, they're not really worried, and they have like they can put as much effort as they want into this thing. Another person could potentially be a much harder worker. They just don't have the time right now. The other thing is like having someone come in through my networks. Here's the thing, like as a hiring manager, it's really hard to hire good people. It's like you reach out to 100 people or like you look at 500 people, and then maybe 10 out of those people make sense for like an on-site interview, and maybe 2 of those people make sense to hire. And like they're not always going to take your offer. And when I was at DigitalOcean, like 60-70% of my job was just building the team. So when I say it takes a lot of discipline, I mean, yes, of course, that bias shouldn't exist. I don't want it to exist. I'm not saying that it existing is a thing that's legitimate. I'm saying in the real world, it does. And as much as that sucks, like that's just the case. Similarly, at GitHub, I had a lot going for me. So like I had just come out of leading, a design team at DigitalOcean. I got to lead it because I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and I stepped up. So I got a lot I lucked into a lot of really valuable experience. It was another dev tools company. That's really interesting. I had all these followers on Twitter. Like as much as that doesn't really mean anything, that creates an image and a certain bias.
It's a signal about some authority, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it means that I, write stuff. I don't know. It doesn't really mean anything.
It's true. That's what that means. Yeah.
Yeah, it means I tweet a lot. And so all of that stuff. And I also got referred in by a friend who had known me for a while. And I also went to conferences, and some of the people there knew me, and some of the people there happened to be following me on Twitter. And, all of this stuff, I think, leads to a certain confirmation bias where like it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the job. Like if you're not equipped to do it and you can't fake it, then you're not going to get it. But if it's you versus another candidate who are equal in all senses, and you have all this stuff going for you, then when you say something, that's going to tell a lot of people, oh, this person is great. When you say good things, it'll tell them this person is great.
I mean, my theory is that it's trust. That essentially what you did is you built. So within a company, you work at a company for 4 or 5 years, eventually, or even less. Eventually, people are going to have an idea of who you are, what you do, what they could expect from you if they work with you as a team member, and what they're going to get out of you. And like everybody at their job knows the person that's really, really good at what they do, and really, really excited to get an opportunity to work with them, or is happy that they're going to be on their team because all right, good, this is going to be solved for me, right? Like they're going to do their job. Awesome. And that's a reputation. And reputation is something that's earned over time, hard work, consistency. And I think that's kind of part of what's happening. That's my theory about this, because this is definitely, I know a lot of people like you, and it's a similar, usually their jobs are similar stories where it's all these different factors of things that they've done and seemingly random things and people that they met and knew at another job. And what it all kind of boils down to is you sort of have a portable reputation that goes with you. It's not necessarily locked up in your job. But I do agree with you. It is frustrating that the hiring process in our industry is so broken that in order to sort of navigate this system in a way that's successful, you have to completely bypass it, and by doing these other things, which in your case, I mean, it requires, like you said, a lot of spare time, a lot of extra energy, and not everybody has those things, and that's not fair, and that's frustrating. So like, it's really interesting to hear your story, and it's so common with everything with other people that I've talked to and other people that I know, and me too, similar thing, that it's really frustrating that like that's not an answer for everybody. It's like you can't, not everybody has that opportunity to do those things. Not everybody's going to land like I had a similar thing where I wrote like a post about some website that Apple put out. Like I reverse engineered it. It went viral a little bit, not too much, but somebody at Apple saw it. And next thing you know, they're asking me to come in for job interviews. I didn't end up going that way. Right. But I didn't even interview, but I thought like, whoa, look at that. Like, wow, I didn't even have to apply for a job. So like that definitely is a way like through the system. But I also really love how you are also focused on the other end of it and trying to eliminate that as a, requirement, trying to improve the process as a hiring manager. So that way that doesn't necessarily have to be part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like the more process that you have around hiring, like the more, not process, but the more explicit everything is. You're just like, okay, these are the skills I'm looking for. These are the mindsets I'm looking for. And people can check those boxes or not, right? And then if you just take that and you're disciplined about like, okay, nothing else outside of this scorecard and this feedback is going to affect my decision, I think we can have more equitable hiring.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I say it's idealized not because it's hard to do, but because people just don't really end up spending much time on hiring. You're rarely ever incentivized to have good hiring. You're incentivized to hire, maybe as a manager, but usually you're incentivized to like push your team and ship product. this is a thing that like not many people really pay attention to, and that sucks. I mean, management in general is a is a is a whole thing, and not many people do management training. Not many people like really engage with it and try to get better. So when I say I haven't been building any hard skills, that doesn't mean that when I became a manager, I didn't read like 100 management books and try and improve the craft there. I think a lot of people don't do that, and they treat it as like, oh, it's like IC level 3 or something. It's like I was a senior engineer or a principal engineer or whatever, and now I'm like a super principal engineer. And like, no, you're not. You're a totally different thing now. And that requires a skill set you don't have. And part of that is how to hire well. And there's no obvious training for that in most places. There's like what is like unconscious bias workshops that companies put you through once a year. Yeah, it's going to take a lot more effort.
Yeah, right. I mean, so in the meantime, I mean, that's such a frustration. But it's a thing we all have to deal with. I mean, it's sort of the reality of the system now. Hopefully, not forever. Well, so one thing I think is a common thread, and we'll wrap up here in a minute. But one thing I think everybody can do, and maybe you'd agree with this, is do a really good job at the job that you're at, and work on your professional relationships with the people at your job. Because I feel like that's one thing everybody can do, and it does eventually over time equal one sort of these like luck surface these sort of like luck opportunities where like, okay, all these people that you work with at this job, now 5 of them are off at 5 different companies, and so when they have something that comes up at their new place, they think of you. So I feel like that's one thing people can do. It sounds like that's been at least a small part of your jobs in the past.
Definitely. I don't think any of my jobs have really, I mean, maybe, making a good impression on like that co-founder led to like, actual people vouching for me. But I wrote blog posts about how I got hired at DigitalOcean, how I got hired at GitHub.
Oh, perfect.
I think you can find those just by Googling how I got hired. It's like a little SEO flex. And then those are just like, here's the exercise that they gave me, the take home, and here's what I did. But then I sent out a newsletter after that, kind of going deeper into the other things. And one of those things, and I think the most valuable of those things, was networking. I'm lucky to be just like an extreme extrovert. And so networking is a thing that I, genuinely always enjoy. And the way that I define that, like the word networking, is just being curious and not being an asshole and like being a decent person. And if you just do that at all times and like you just meet someone and you're like, oh, tell me more because genuinely you want to know, that stuff has never been like a fake thing to me. And it's always like every opportunity I can probably take back to just like some person that I was, friendly to and I was interested in and they were interested in me. I do have like, I think one more thing to say about this full stack anxiety idea.
Please.
So I said like earlier, 3-4 years of not really learning any hard skills. And that's true because like I started just like thinking more and sketching more and doing more high level stuff. But recently, I've had this like sudden ambition to learn stuff. I wanted to make a thing, right? Not necessarily a specific thing. I just had like this surge of like, I really want to make a thing now. And so in the past, 3 weeks, I've learned like React and Node and WebSockets and like CSS Grid and all these things. And so, I mean, to me, that was all like, it's super exciting. I'm like, kind of kicking myself because all of it's really easy and I don't understand why I didn't do it until now. But also I think what that says is the anxiety around kind of being left behind by the industry and not having the skill set needed to go somewhere. I mean, if you have the context, right? Like all of this stuff is online. All of it is super cheap or free. And it's actually like really easy to catch up. And I think that's a thing I didn't always really understand. And I think that's maybe a thing that leads to a lot of this panic and anxiety. Just this idea that this stuff is permanent. And if I don't catch up now, I'll never catch up. When actually, like, because everything changes so frequently, like inherently to that, everyone is learning stuff anew. So you're only ever like, your cap of being behind is like 3 years. Like you can't be more than 3 years behind because if you don't learn anything for 10 years, you're still only 3 years behind because the new thing has only existed for 3 years. And I think that's really interesting and it's kind of calming for me.
It's definitely calming to know that that catching up is not necessarily this huge monumental task that's impossible, that learning these new skills is within your grasp, it's within everybody's grasp. And you maybe don't even need to turn it into a daily grind. It could be, wait a little bit until you're feeling, engaged and want to work on a project. I think learning these things through a side project, like what you're doing, is maybe one of the best ways to pick up stuff quickly versus trying to just grind through stuff and learn it without some sort of context. All right, man. Thank you so much for doing this. This was really great.
Of course. Thank you for having me.